Let's talk about the Nile River, because if you want to study ancient Nubia, ancient Kemet, you want to know a lot about the Nile, or at least get some important things about it to help you understand that history and how that history kind of developed. So let's imagine you are someone who is living, 5,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, and you're living in Lower Nubia or Upper Nubia. What would the Nile be like, and how would you be able to transverse it and go up and down and travel up and down? And one thing to know is that the Nile is one of the longest rivers in the world, not the longest river. It's over 4,000 miles long. And so the Nile, one source of the Nile is from the highlands of Ethiopia. So the Blue Nile comes from the highlands of Ethiopia, which you kind of see a picture in the back there. It's the highlands of Ethiopia, and it flows from south going north. So it will meet in Khartoum, and it's going to meet the White Nile, the other major source of the Nile, which is coming from Central Eastern Africa. So if you go down to Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, that huge water source is there. It feeds the Nile from that part of Africa, from that Central Eastern part of Africa. It feeds the Nile. And so the Blue Nile and the White Nile meet in Khartoum, and there they form the regular Nile, if you will, and they flow out to the Mediterranean Sea. Now there's some other things that comes into play there with cataracts, which we'll talk about later, but that's a general flow of the Nile. It flows from south to north, from the highlands of Ethiopia and from Central Eastern Africa. It flows from south to north out to the Mediterranean Sea. And when you think about that, what that means for you and what that meant for Kemetic people in particular is that they oriented themselves toward the south. So imagine the world, take a map and flip it upside down. You flip it upside down. They oriented themselves toward the source of the Nile, so where they would believe their people came from as well. They oriented themselves from the source, based on the source of the Nile. So the Nile is flowing from south to north, if you will. So Upper Nubia would be in the south, Lower Nubia is the north. And then Upper Egypt is south of Lower Egypt, which would be further north. So it kind of just flips the map upside down, and that was their orientation. That's how they looked at the world. Their orientation was that way. And why is that important? How did that affect them? What did that do if you were sailing the Nile, like I said, 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years ago? Well, it would have an impact in terms of how you sail and how skilled you'd be. So let's imagine here, we're looking at this map here from a southern orientation, looking at south as being up. If you were going from Upper Nubia, let's say to Lower Nubia, well, the Nile will be flowing, the current would be flowing in that direction. It's flowing from south to north. So it's flowing in that direction. You could, very easily or relatively easily have a boat or barge or sailboat, and you could easily just flow with the current of the Nile, maybe use paddles, use steering to get where you need to go, because you were flowing with the flow of the Nile. Now, if you wanted to go in the opposite direction, let's say you want to go from Lower Nubia to Upper Nubia, you were flowing against the Nile. So that would be a bit of a challenge. You're flowing against the flow of the current. And now you have the wind at your back, though. So you could use sails. So sailboats were also important. So a lot of these boats were equipped with sails to get them from the north to the south. And on the return trip, from south to north, they could go with the flow and the current of the Nile. And that becomes very important because, as you think about just how skilled people were and the way people use boats, it's very important to think about that. And I'll share a story with you. Back when I was in school, back in middle school, years and years ago, back in middle school, junior high school, I remember a teacher talking about boats, and we were talking about shipping, and we were in class. And I remember the teacher, and I forget exactly what class, but I remember the teacher saying specifically that the Vikings were the first people in the world to develop ships, develop any type of boats. And I thought to myself, wow, that's not true. I know people had boats in Africa and other places in the world. It wasn't just the Vikings. Not that there's anything against the Vikings, but they weren't the first. But the teacher was like, no, just any type of boat, period. The Vikings were the first. And I knew that was wrong, but I didn't have the information to combat that. I couldn't, share something with her to let her know that, hey, that I know that's not correct. But I left that classroom, and I left really actually that day. I remember leaving that day thinking, wow, that was wrong information that she gave us. And everybody in the class got it. And I don't know how to combat that. I don't know how to challenge that. So when I see this and I look at this, it's very important to understand that people in Nubia, people in ancient Kemet, they used ships a long time ago. Before Kemet was even a country, before the two lands united into Kemet, if you will, they were already using ships. And they were using it in Nubia, in Lower Nubia. They were using it in Kemet. They were using ships in both way back then. So it's important for us to teach our children this important history and the contributions of everyone around the world. So I wanted to share that because that's a very important point. That took a lot of skill and coordination for people in the Nile Valley to be using ships 5,000 years ago, many thousands of years ago. We know people around the world and other places were also using ships. That's a very important thing to kind of communicate. So just wanted to share that piece of information and how important it is to study the Nile and these few pieces of information about it to help you understand your studies when it comes to Nubia.